Okay, so welcome to the first e-Memoir session of the 2017-2018 term. We're looking at improving the efficiency and effectiveness of traineeships, and this session is going to be led by Beej Kaczmarczyk. We like to keep the sessions as interactive as possible, so please feel free to use the question and chat facility, or even if you'd like to use a microphone, just let me know and I'll activate it for you. Keep the questions coming. If you're watching this on a video as well and you've got any questions, you will have our contact details, which will be shown at the end of the video, and I'd encourage you to get in contact with us. I'm going to hand over to Beej now. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Marek, and welcome to those of you, particularly those of you who are new listeners, as well as those of you who are obviously our frequent users of our service, and of course, most significantly, those of you who have taken out the annual subscription. Details of that, by the way, will be available at the very end of this webinar. As Marek says, we've been running one or two webinars over the August-September period, but this is actually the formal start of the new subscriptions for this year. So those of you that have had a chance to listen in on ones that we've been looking at, particularly in terms of the ones to do with the apprenticeship, getting ready for the levy, etc., those are available in our back catalogue, and you can access those if you're a subscriber. One of the things that I want to look at, and this is just almost a word of warning before I look at the efficiency and effectiveness traineeships, is it is a very, very strange, confusing sort of scene at the moment with traineeships. You know, after some years of relatively small growth in the take-up, we've started to experience a bit of a downturn in the number of new starts on traineeships. And I think what I would want to emphasize here is that I've seen very good models of traineeships which have been efficient and effective, and I'm going to sort of bring those lessons to bear and share them with you. But also I've seen other models where they haven't quite achieved what they were setting out to do, partly because I don't think that there was a clarity about what they were trying to do. And I think you can see that now in issues about the branding of traineeships, even the name traineeships. Would it be better to call them something else, like a shorter study program or a pre-apprenticeship program, whatever? So those are some of the issues that I think you've already raised, certainly in previous webinars, looking at these issues. So what's the background? Well, it has been traineeships have been part of the government's education and training policy. You see mention of them in the skills strategy, and you see mention of them in the productivity strategy as well. This is going back, you know, over the course of the last 5 years. They've certainly been seen as a real option, a really good quality option for 16 to 24-year-olds without work. And that in itself creates a bit of an issue. Rather than have one model of traineeships, when in effect we've got two models reflecting the two different funding sources, even though both of those funding sources are the ESFA. One is very much oriented towards the 16 to 18-year-olds, so therefore it's an aspect of study programs, and the other one is much more geared to the 19 to 24-year-olds who are without work, who are unemployed. I think the key, if you want, characteristic of the effective traineeships, and there have been some, although the number of those graded through Ofsted has been relatively small, but they've often been mentioned in either adult education offer or in the study program offer, is that it has to have this effective partnership between employers and training providers. So whether you're a college, a training provider, a local authority, that is really the key point in terms of being able to plan and deliver an effective traineeship, is that partnership between yourself and the respective employers, whether it be small, medium-sized employers or larger employers, whether it be private sector or public sector. And I think that's absolutely critical. Now, in terms of who's able to offer traineeships, at one point there were some restrictions, and basically, you know, you had to be either outstanding or good. I think those requirements have been removed, so it's quite a free market in traineeships, and particularly those of you who maybe don't have a contract to deliver 16 to 18 study programs, there have been what we call market entry points, where you've been able to offer traineeships in addition to whatever you're doing, for example, adult education. As I said, the numbers have been increasing steadily since 2013-14, with just over 42,500 learners that have gone through the experience. So it's a relatively small number of learners when you look at the number of learners covered by 16 to 18 study programs and obviously apprenticeships as well as adult education. And as I said, the concern has been there about the more recent downturn, certainly in that period between August 2016 and January 2017. The government has been expecting more and different employers to sign up as the programme has been developed. But that in itself, I think, has been another problem, and another reason why it's not been as effective is if we're asking a lot of employers about their awareness of traineeships, as we've been doing recently about the awareness of the changes in apprenticeships, a lot of employers, including some large employers, have demonstrated that they have a very limited, if in some cases no knowledge of what a traineeship is. However, if you start to talk about a pre-apprenticeship program, there's a greater familiarity because that's obviously been done by some of them through things like group training arrangements, etc. in the past. I think the other thing is, and you have recently been aware that there's been concerns over not only the availability of traineeships, but also what quality are there and what kind of experience has the trainee been getting. Has this been, cheap labour? Has this been a form of internship without great hope of securing employment at the end of it? Why hasn't it led to as many people getting jobs and as many people getting apprenticeships? So there have been some real concerns, and I think that reflects obviously some of the issues around the actual design and delivery of those traineeship programs up to now. And I want to look at some of those issues with you. So although I will spend a wee bit of time looking at the funding issues, because that's obviously critical when it comes to looking at efficiency, I think it's just important to remind ourselves that they are an education and training program where the key component is that work placement, that experience of work with an employer or employers that's helping those young people to obviously develop the skills, the confidence, those softer skills that they need to get a job, but preferably to be able to progress to an apprenticeship, a job with an apprenticeship. If not, at least to make a good informed decision about, for example, taking on a larger FE program than that traineeship. So the characteristics of a traineeship, and I think these are important because when you sort of look at what were the design features, you can see to some extent where some of the problems have been. The first thing is that they're not subjects. They're not really a course. A traineeship is what I'd call a holistic approach, which involves different elements. Those elements are what we call the design features. And those elements are there to either re-engage a learner or engage a learner that's not thought of the world of work and an apprenticeship and develop those other skills, those attitudes, which are, of course, essential for that young person, 16 to 24, to secure employment, and preferably employment with an apprenticeship. So the reason that's critical is because the main reason that that age group has not been able to secure employment with those high levels of youth unemployment has been twofold. One has been the lack of a relevant quality work experience, and that's one of the key characteristics. So if you can't offer relevant, high quality, very focused work placements, don't do traineeships. And secondly, they haven't had that wider range of skills, which isn't just communication and numeracy skills or ESOL, it's also those other softer skills. And those are the two main barriers why some young people can't access the labour market. So it's going to be a holistic approach. You bring everything around the needs of that individual learner. Therefore, it must be tailor-made to meet that individual learner's needs. And the emphasis has got to be, how does this traineeship get you to where you want to be? Either a job with an apprenticeship, or into some further education and training. It has to be integrated. That's that holistic approach that brings together all aspects of student services, advice and guidance, careers, tutorial, learning support, as well as always the other things you do to record and report on student progress. And what is critical here is it's a very iterative process, because you've got to constantly check. Because remember, sometimes you've only got the learner for 8 to 12 weeks. Is this still the right pathway for you? Is this still the right program? Are you enjoying it? Are you learning? Are you benefiting from it? Are your chances of getting a job improving and certainly not worsening? It's also, of course, fully funded. So whether it be a young person funded through the study program or an adult funded through the adult education budget, all trainees up to and including the age of 24 are fully funded. So this is obviously an entitlement that removes some of those barriers. But obviously, one of the key things there is the sustainability of this funding, and obviously that makes it difficult for you as a provider in terms of justifying investments in traineeships if you're never quite sure if that funding's always going to be there. As I said, the key characteristic for me is, and this is one of the reasons that the evaluation, and it's come from the evaluation from different sources, and by the way, a new evaluation is just being started in Wales of their traineeship programs, and it'll be interesting to see the results of that, is that the key, if you want, to effective engagement with the learner is effective engagement with a prospective employer. Because either they provide the work placement or the work placements, they also have to be a key partner in the design and delivery of the actual learning on the job, but also make contributions to the stuff that's done off the job, for example, in a college or in your training centre. And at the very end of the process, that lead employer must offer as a minimum either an exit interview, which says, you know, we can't give you a job at the moment, we can't offer you an apprenticeship. However, we will interview you, we'll go through all your characteristics, and we'll provide you with the if you want, the references that are needed to move you on. Or a formal interview where a vacancy exists. And certainly we found that because of the way we've worked with some employers, those employers who have had a clear, if you want, endpoint, which is this is a way of, in effect, creating an interim labour market. So this is an attempt to match what we need with the characteristics of the learner through the traineeship. And if that match is effective, then there's a vacancy that we already have. That person indicates that they've got all the characteristics, certainly through the work placement, to fill the essential characteristics and the specification, as well as the job description. And then that person becomes employed, and hopefully that person becomes employed with an apprenticeship. So I think a message to those of you listening in who may be not so sure about doing traineeships, or your first experience with traineeships has not been wonderful, either for you or for the learner, is that engagement is the key thing. Once you've got the engagement with a prospective employer, who therefore has to understand what a traineeship is, and we find that there's certainly three sets of barriers to effective delivery of traineeships. One is the students don't understand what a traineeship is. Some of them are not even aware that it is a traineeship. They're on something different. Secondly, the employer doesn't often have a clear understanding. And I don't think sometimes the staff that you bring in to deliver components understand that it's not a subject. I might be doing a part of it. I might be doing some of the flexible, say a little diploma or certificate, but you've got to see it in that much more holistic approach. So in effect, traineeships are a form of interim labour market. So it's about making sure that you create the conditions of a labour market where you've got the demand for labour from the employer, the actual young person is the actual supply, and you're bringing those two together and seeing if it melds through the experience of a traineeship. So to some extent, it often will end up being a pre-apprenticeship, and maybe that's something we've learned from this experience. So for us, the key reason why we've been able to get effective, working with, I know, with some large employers, but also groups of employers, for example, the FSB, is that we've been able to get that matching process right. So this has been seen as a labour market intervention, not a course, not a qualification. That's what's been the critical aspect of this. So we're bringing the employer who has a clear need for staff, for a resource, and has got expectations of that resource. The learner who has got their characteristics, their prior history, their skill set, their profile, and we try and match those two together with an appropriate program. And therefore the program is the result of that coming together. It's not a set program. And certainly from those first experiences of traineeships where you say, well, we've got an engineering traineeship, this will be what you do, X, Y, and Z. No, it has to be, it might be in the pathway of engineering, but each one of those individual learners and employers might have a slightly different shaped program. And that's where I think the flexibility issue has come in, especially if you're trying to ensure viability at the same time. And then obviously the match is with you, the provider. If you think that you can do the match process between the needs of the learner and the needs of the employer and create that appropriate program, then do it. If not, then I think it's better not to engage with the traineeship offer. So I think those 4 things have got to come together. And obviously the ESFA's job is to make sure that the resource is available either for that young person or that 19 to 24-year-old through the adult education budget, to make sure all those things come together. Ofsted's role is to quality assure and make sure that that is a good quality experience for everyone concerned, but most notably for the learner. We've got a question then about how do we, and it's a good question, thanks very much for the first question, about how do you go about doing that match between the employer's needs and the learner needs. I think one of the key things we found, certainly working with National Express, IKEA, so local authority, we've also worked with a health trust, we've also worked with a group training association, and we've worked with retail developers, for example, in Leeds and elsewhere, is that we ask the employers to give us a profile of the staff they're likely to be employing, in terms of their skill sets, their attitudes, etc. We profile the learners, and very often there are existing learners, our level 2 learners, or in some cases new learners that have come on the study program or come to us from under the adult education, are not quite sure what they want to do. They're not ready to go straight into a job. They need a bit of a finishing touch. And that's obviously one of the conditions here is we're not talking about not in education, employment and training, the most disadvantaged learners. We're not talking about them. We found, for example, with existing level 2s, they've finished a year, they've done the level 2 diploma, they had the week of work experience, they're not quite ready to go into a job, they don't want to do a level 3. We can't really push them forward for an apprenticeship because they've still got some issues about a lack of clarity about the pathway. A traineeship is ideal. What we do is we profile those learners and we use a system. We know that some of you have used DISC. We use other systems to profile the learners. We get some idea of what kind of skill set they've got, what kind of attitudinal set, what kind of confidence they've got, what their abilities are, their emotional intelligence, etc. And then we do a bit of a match up with the employer. We'd also recommend that you use, there's some very good profiling systems available. UExplore, for example. We've recently had a demonstration to us of Talent Finder, and there are other obviously ones which can do this. But I think that's critical because once you get that match between the learner and the employer, it's a lot easier then to design the program because you know exactly whose needs you're trying to meet. And because the biggest element of it is the work placement, and that's very individual, that therefore allows you to make sure that the majority of the experience is exactly what those two sets of people do. You wrap around it then the mentoring, the tutoring, the English and maths, which would be offer anyway as part of your offer, and that's how you can ensure that you have a viable offer. It is important to realise who is currently eligible for the programme. As we said, it's 16 to 24-year-olds that have not yet achieved a full level 3, so they could have achieved a level 2. Key thing is they've had little or no relevant work experience. They have the potential to go into employment or an apprenticeship within 6 months. So these are not in education, employment and training. They have to be unemployed using the new definition, which can include, of course, having some part-time jobs, etc. But most importantly, don't forget that through the study program aspect of this, that's the 16 to 19 funding formula, we also include those learners up to 24 that have got education and health care plans, and they're funded under the study program system rather than under the adult education system. So the eligibility is critical. So they're not really for the most disengaged, and I think obviously if you've taken on the most disengaged, that would have led to some issues and problems because they're so far back in their readiness. And will a program of a maximum of 6 months actually achieve what you want to achieve? If they've already got this qualification, skills and experience needed to find work or apprenticeships, then why go through this? That's obviously what we're trying to achieve with the traineeship, and it's also not suitable for those that are certainly in jobs that involve a significant number of hours where they've pretty well made up their minds about what their career opportunities are going to be. So who's eligible to offer? The eligibility, by the way, is quite open because in effect the requirement to be graded good or outstanding has disappeared. So therefore it's quite an open market. Those of you who are already working with 16 to 19-year-olds can offer traineeships as part of your study program. Those of you with a contract to deliver adult learning or a grant funded can fund that as part of your adult education budget. But there's also opportunities. For example, if you've not had a contract to deliver 16 to 19, but you've had a contract to deliver adult learning, including community learning, you could obviously bid to offer 16 to 18 traineeships, for example. And there are various market entry opportunities which I know are available. Again, just make sure that you understand on, particularly from the adult education side, you understand how that works, and particularly how management of performance will work. So in effect, it's quite an open market, and I know that obviously some of you have engaged quite effectively with it. So at this point, you know, just as you're listening in, and you've already asked that sort of first question, of those of you listening in, how many of you are currently offering traineeships on a significant scale? When I say significant scale, you've got maybe upwards of 50 or so trainees. So if any of you listening in have got more than 50 trainees, give us some idea. You just do that by raising your hands. Yeah, that's it. We've got 1 or 2. And we assume that the rest have got less than 50. Yeah, good. And are any of you, by the way, not currently offering traineeships but are keen to do so? Just want a bit more guidance and a bit more. Yeah, we've got 1 or 2 that have indicated that's also the scenario. And I think it's good because I think, you know, whether you're offering them to young people or 19 to 24s or both, you know, having a range of learners for different aspects is quite useful, because that tells you a little bit about how complex that labour market intervention is, because it has got to be very much driven by what the employer is seeking and how well that individual learner matches that. Even having 40 or so, you know, you could spread that over 3 or 4 classes is quite, I think, a significant number compared to what I've seen certainly in some institutions where the number of trainees is only maybe 1 group or 2 at the most. So what are the key, thanks very much for those answers. What are the key features? Well, as I've said all the way, it is predominantly a labour market intervention. Therefore, it must involve, as a significant proportion, a work placement or placements, because you can have obviously more than one, where you might, for example, be giving a person a chance to try 2 pathways, you know, which might be related, and they might be with 2 different employers. So you've got to have that element there. And certainly for 16 to 18-year-old learners, that will be the majority of the hours that they have, because they're funded on the planned number of hours. It has to involve some kind of work preparation training, job seeking, CV development, all that sort of stuff that we talk about in terms of understanding the way the labour market works, the matching process, the careers, etc. For those learners that have not yet achieved the functional skill at level 2 or GCSE at grade 4, then there's an assumption there will be some English, maths or ESOL, and we'll come back to that, because obviously we also have learners who are following ESOL rather than English as part of their traineeship program. And then what we call the flexible element. But remember, the flexible element, which is, you know, particularly for adults, has got to be from recognised qualifications which are eligible for funding. But you can also include, under the flexibilities, some non-accredited learning where it's appropriate, particularly when it develops what we call the work preparation aspects. All the way through, we're assuming there's mentoring and support, and that's the tutorial, the coaching, and that which goes on. And of course, the key thing is that when you design it, the employer is a key partner in designing it, because it's got to meet their needs, or if, for example, you're working across a range of employers, something that meets the needs of the local labour market. So, for example, increasingly, we're seeing through the devolution of the adult education budget, some involvement of those combined authorities and commissioners in actually also stipulating that they want to see traineeships of a certain shape and design as being offered as part of the local flexibilities. So once you've got those key, and again, if you don't get those key elements right for the individual, you're going to have either problems on retention or problems on outcome in terms of progression. So again, I think it's difficult when you say, well, we're going to have an engineering pathway. but engineering is quite broad. It's the key thing is find the employers, and then each employer will have a range of experiences they can offer that individual learner, which might not cover the whole of mechanical or the whole of electrical, but give the learner at least enough of that experience to then say, yeah, this looks like the right place for me. I want to now go forward for full employment in that sector or an apprenticeship. Or I might not, and instead just go and do a full-time level 3 program with you, or a level 2 program with you in college or in a training centre. So those are the sort of key design features. And again, you can see again, when it comes to improving the efficiency, the effectiveness, the program has got to be designed with very much that individual learner in mind. Now, the length of the program, it's between 6 weeks and 6 months. And as I said, therefore, you know, again, what's the average length of your traineeships? There is no optimum length. It's the length that actually gives both the employer and the learner long enough to actually get to know each other, familiarize each other, and make decisions about whether they want to commit to each other. So we found that some of the programs last up to 26 weeks, some 18, some 12, some as short as 8. And again, that's got to be designed with the needs of the employer in mind, particularly where they've got cycles in their business. But the key thing here is that it's got to be individualized again for what that learner needs. So, for example, the traineeships that are offered with Wyvale and Dobies, the garden centres, fit with the recruitment pattern and when they are busiest. So again, the traineeships have to supply labour there for the end of March and the beginning of Easter. And of course, as I said, if you find that the learner wants to maybe taste one or two aspects of a particular pathway, then more than one placement can be offered. But we obviously, what we do is we aggregate the hours for those 2 placements or 3 placements in terms of the total resource that's available. What is critical is the progression from, and this is where there is disappointment, you know, it's varied between young people in 19 to 24s, but certainly the progression into apprenticeships is not as good, the apprenticeship into employment. Much more progression into further study, which in itself is good if that means we're preventing the person from not engaging. There are, of course, key outcomes that we're seeking, and you'll find that those outcomes define what employment is, at least 8 weeks of over 16 hours within 6 months of completing the traineeship. And of course, if it's into further education, it must be a substantial qualification. And of course, it must be one that enhances that learner and moves them on. So that's key, because again, when you're trying to look at improving your effectiveness, these are key measures of your effectiveness. And if you're not getting that right, particularly because you've got the wrong match or you haven't spent enough time on that, what I call initial process, the planning and design is critical here. If you don't get that right, in effect, you're not going to get the outcomes. The key thing about English and Maths is that there is still an expectation that you will improve the skills, certainly from the start point for that learner. So either at what qualification level do they come in, or what have you assessed them at. We're expecting, it's a shorter program, so the chances obviously to achieve a GCSE are less relevant. Certainly improving their functional skills in English and Maths or ESOL, or at least doing some of the smaller qualifications that are required. However, be aware that for 16 to 18-year-olds on traineeships, there's still the condition of funding. However, they are defined as part-time students. So again, we've had to clarify that in the past. That means if they get a grade D or a grade 3, they're not required to study a GCSE. They could obviously be using one of the stepping stone qualifications. If, however, they've achieved the functional skills at level 2, then we do expect them to be working towards. Now, they're not going to achieve it because this might not fit with a cycle, but or when the GCSEs are actually exams are available. However, there is an expectation they could complete them after they've finished their traineeship. One thing to note, if you run a traineeship of less than 150 hours, the requirements are actually relaxed for 16 to 18-year-olds. However, the expectation is you'd still do some English and Maths, even if it was not necessarily accredited. For adults, of course, we do expect them, again, if they haven't formally achieved the GCSE at grade 4 or above, or functional skills at level 2, that they can undertake an English and Maths or ESOL program at the appropriate level, as long as it's a level higher than what they've already achieved, or it's higher than what they've been assessed at. And again, as I said, that can be completed after the end of the traineeship, particularly because in some cases you'll find that learners don't complete the traineeship because they've actually secured full-time work with an apprenticeship. Therefore, they can complete the English and Maths as part of their apprenticeship offer. So again, just keep that in mind. So structuring the program is critical for me because, again, when it comes to improving the effectiveness, we learned from our first experiences that by not spending enough time on the structure, it was inappropriate. We assumed that all the learners needed 18 to 24 weeks when in fact it wasn't necessarily the case. We thought they all needed the same sort of English and Maths. Well, that wasn't the case. We had to think a little bit more flexibly. However, it's critical that the duration is long enough for that learner to have benefited from the experience of the work placement in particular. You can offer more than one pathway, and I know that from one of you, you've said already that you offer several pathways. We found it easier to link to an employer and a set of occupations with an employer. So our pathways were defined by the needs of the employer. So for example, Debenhams, although quite a lot of it was in retail, some of it was in IT, some was in business admin. So although we had one employer, there were several pathways into that employer. For others, if you're working with SMEs, it might be a very specific pathway. Like for example, it might be a votive vehicle for a backstreet garage in say Ilkeston. Well, that's okay, but that learner might be able to then fit in with other learners doing motor vehicle in terms of things like English and Maths or whatever. I think it's going to be an appropriate mix, and therefore getting the distribution between the work placement and the other elements is critical. We certainly found that sooner we got the learners on the work placement, the better. We were more likely to retain them. This is exactly what they were looking for. Plus, obviously, the experience they had that we delivered either in our training centre or on through online learning. I think the other thing is to say that if there are opportunities in the labour market for the learner to actually take up full-time employment and apprenticeship, we have to have a natural stepping off point, which might be when we know who the employers are and we know that the patterns of recruitment are X. For example, in the garden centre industry, it tends to be end of February, beginning of March. Then we make sure that there's a stepping off point for those learners that can then go for those jobs. For us, the big issue has been efficiency. It's been viability. And as one of you has already said, particularly when you've got mixed age groups, we've got two different funding approaches, two methodologies. We find that with the younger learners, it's easier to work it out because we just work at the total hours. But for adults, we've got to have recognised qualifications, particularly in the flexible offer. And sometimes we've had mixed age groups where the learners have come from Job Centre Plus, they're older learners, and they're maybe not as committed or aware of what this programme, in other words, it was sold to them rather than it was promoted to them and they were properly guided onto it. And we often find, and I don't know if any of you found, that that's where the effectiveness has suffered, where we've had that mixed age group. I mean, can I just ask how many of you are running it as mixed age groups, or have you tended to try and have a 16 to 18 group and then an older group, and that seems to have worked? Yeah, we've had one person in particular says that you've actually separated them out, having had that experience already. It didn't work as well. Others say, no, it's worked okay. So I think, again, it depends on the personalities and how those people have come together. One thing to note, by the way, is that not all the programs themselves only contain those little qualifications that might recognise the skills that they've acquired, say the level 1 or 2 certificates. But also, we found that what's helped to promote it and add what I call a sort of almost like a quality mark is recognition at local level from the LEPs or the combined authorities. And again, that tells you that because a LEP or a combined authority has put a stamp on it, a kite mark, that traineeship has had a little bit more currency in the labour market and helped those learners to progress. That certainly improved their effectiveness as well. So again, how you structure it is very much, around your individual labour market needs, the needs of the employer, and obviously what the learners think is the best shape. This is quite a traditional structure. You can see it's shaped over the 6 months, very much the sort of ones that we were running at the very beginning. And you can see that the work placement, by month 2, they're in the work placement. That would be 3 days a week over 4 months. They had 1 day in the training centre every week for over that 6 months, and that was for tutorial, their English and Maths. You can see at the front end, we put a lot of the job preparation stuff, the matching went on, the profiling went on there, and then of course we tidy things up. The English and Maths in all these cases were either units of qualifications or full functional skills. And you can do that over 6 months. Again, the 6 months was not necessarily September to July. It could have been, you know, October through to Easter. In some cases, it was January right through to the sort of June, July period. Again, depending on the recruitment of learners and obviously the offer that we were getting from employers. But again, you can see it's a maximum of 6 months. Can I just ask those of you listening in, what's your average length of traineeship? Because again, we found that there's no optimum. You can't say that the 12-week ones have been more effective than the 24 to 26. It's the content, it's the actual quality of the work placement has been the key determinant for us. Okay, so yeah, we've got 12 to 18 weeks. That seems quite common. 26 weeks, yeah. So there's quite a range here of structure and durations. Obviously, the longer the duration, the more risk you've got of things like non-retention. Towards 6 months, thank you, Mark. 11 weeks, Paul, thanks very much. Again, that 11 to 12 weeks we found works quite well with when you've got a clear view of what the learner wants to do and a clear view of what the employer wants to do. We found that 11 to 12 weeks has been a really good period, particularly where we've front-loaded that work placement into week 2 and got going quite quickly on it. We found it was very successful. Again, because the work placement, the preparation, English and Maths, the tutorial is a sort of core, you can then actually offer different pathways, because the way you deliver those pathways is you can either infill the learners into existing offers, such as a level 1 award or whatever, but if you have enough learners, particularly if you restrict this to your pre-apprenticeship offer, then you could say, well, we have got an apprenticeship in working with children, we've got these learners not ready, there's 12 of them in this group, they've got a common set of characteristics, we will offer them the level 1 award, and hopefully some of them will then progress to an apprenticeship. And you could do the same again. We found that by working with the employers, particularly where they had several pathways into the same employer, that meant we could obviously offer the most important aspect there would be, of course, that they got a good quality work placement. Again, there's not a requirement to always offer a qualification. That's the flexible element of it. And you might find that actually more emphasis should be put on things like the behavior and confidence building than necessarily giving them a small qualification. Again, particularly if you've only got 11 to 12 weeks, all you might be offering is an award. So again, who have you found being, having had experience of traineeships has been the best type of employer? Has it been the large employer, the SME, the employer working solely, or the employer working in a group? Because we've worked obviously with group training associations, it's been easier. Working with the Federation of Small Businesses means you get greater access to that range of employers. Maybe some of you have been working with the local health trust or the local authority. Those of you, by the way, are local authority providers. If you're the training arm or the education arm, you can obviously offer placements in other parts of the local authority, because they are seen as quite different if you want enterprises. So you might be the training arm, but you can offer a placement within, say, housing or within finance or whatever. So large employers, we've had 1 or 2 of you saying working with the health trusts. Good. That's a response from the Northwest. And we've also got working with a group of garages, yeah. So that's a sort of local group of garages which have been looking for those trainees. Yeah, good. So we've got a range there of approaches. Yeah, there's a good one from Paul. Thanks very much. SMEs wanting apprentices and wanting to use traineeships as a pre-apprenticeship program and work trial. And that is exactly what a labour market, an interim labour market, is about. This is like making sure the match is right. So again, we found that working with SMEs, that's taking some of the risk out of actually taking on that apprentice. And I know there've been the sort of stories about cheap labour and then simply reprocessing. We actually haven't found that, because we had that relationship right in the first place, But also you can do this effectively through through the subcontractors. Again, if you've got good subcontractors that have got great relationships with employers, and Graham said that, then it's really useful. I think working with the local authorities and working with some of the public sector organisations has been actually a good way forward, as well with the larger retail developers. And I'll explain that as well. So what about the efficiency side? I've mentioned a lot about the effectiveness. Well, as you know, traineeships are funded through different sources. For 16 to 18-year-olds, and that includes up to 24 with an education and healthcare plan, you're funded through what we call study programs. Here, the core learning aim has got to be the work placement. That will be the predominant part of the program, the majority of hours. And as long as the learner's retained on that, in effect, they're achieving that particular learning aim, and that means you'll secure the funding. We apply all the usual rules in terms of postal code, learning support to those trainees. They're not different from any other 16 to 18-year-old on, or 16 to 19-year-old on a study program. They can obviously access the bursary fund, and in some cases, although the length of work placement and the number of hours that they spend is limited, they can also claim benefits, particularly for your 18-year-olds. The key thing here is that once you know what the total number of hours is for the whole of the experience, you put them into the appropriate funding band, and then that band gives you the resource. And that's obviously part of your plan numbers. It works on the lag number effect. Remember that all these things that determine how efficient the program is are all driven by that basic funding methodology. So here's an example of a 16 to 18 traineeship. This is one of the 18-week ones. You can see that they're doing a little level 1 award. Yeah, that's the flexible element. Functional skills in English and maths, 3 hours a week while they're in the training centre. And you can see that they're also getting tutorial coaching and careers guidance. This is where we constantly update their CVs, their profiles. But the bulk of what they do is the 2.5 hours, 2.5 days there a week that they do for 10 weeks in the work placement with one or more employers. Now that produces a total resource of £2,700. As long as the learner is retained in the programme or completes the programme using one of the definitions of an outcome, progression to further education, progression to employment, progression to an apprenticeship, we'll have earned that £2,700. Now the key thing here is how many learners have we recruited onto this programme? Because they've all done, in this case, they've all done the same employability skills. What differentiated the program was the work placements. So whatever pathway they had, one was retail, one was admin, one was IT, the work placement was the means by which we differentiated. It meant that for the English, maths and the employability skills, the group was taught together, and that ensured an efficient delivery. However, it wasn't just about efficiency, because although it was quite cost efficient, I just want to tell you a little story here. 12 starters on this program who theoretically should have earned us 12 times £2,700. Only 8 completed. Why? Because the match was not right. This is one of the what I'd call early experiences which we learnt from. So only 8 completed. That meant 4 in effect lost us half of the 2,700. That's, remember, the core aim, non-retention loses you 50%. And that's obviously done through the lag number effect. So in effect, our total income from that was not 32,000 but 27,000. However, by using the right shape of lectures to deliver the right program, we used lectures to deliver the employability skills, we used mentors to do the tutorial, we used assessors to go and visit them in the workplace. So they're all on what we call, these are the hourly rates. And we also put in material cost. The actual delivery of the program was £13,500. That's the direct cost, which meant we made the contribution of 50% because the overhead was the other 50% of the total revenue that we earned. So you can see that this is a cost-efficient model because it's covered its cost, both direct and its contribution to overheads, and the target in this institution is 50% contribution target. But I wouldn't describe this as effective because, in effect, we've got 33% of the learners did not complete the program. That means they were not retained, they didn't get a job, they didn't move on. So in terms of quality, this is not a good program to have 67% success or achievement rate on. And in fact, that would be a significant weakness. So again, although it's been cost efficient, it wasn't effective. And I know that you might say, well, that's only 12 learners. Well, but that's what we've tended to work with. Now, obviously with the match now, we're getting 12 starters and 12 completers, so it's delivering a much better return. We're actually finding that we're making a significant surplus now, but also we're getting 100% in terms of outcomes and achievement. So that's where the quality and the effectiveness that we've been talking about is cut in. So I'm sure that you've done something very similar. But again, can I just ask, for those of you delivering traineeships for 16 to 18-year-olds, what is the sort of average group size that you're getting? And what do you need to break even? Because we're breaking even roughly on 12 starters, even though we're only getting a 67% retention rate. So just what sort of your average numbers, and what do you need for break even? So we're getting some interesting figures here. 14 we're getting for break even. Yeah, average group size 10. That would struggle unless you had a different cost base. Again, we're using different staff. We're using lecturers to deliver the flexible bits, the English and maths, but we're using different staff, for example, to go and visit them on. We're using assessors, because the assessors obviously, for example, we've got apprentices and trainees at the same employer, so the assessor is actually visiting both and having a chat with the employer about and getting feedback. We got some figures there, 12. Not doing group delivery, rolling and delivering infill into the classes. Mark, again, that is, again, you can have in a particular class, in a particular pathway, you can have learners who are on the study program as well as learners on a traineeship. It's just that they have a different way of achieving their learning aims and a different shape of that program. Paul's telling us 12 to 14 as a preferred optimum, can just about break even if it's 8. Well, if you have 8 starters and 8 completers and you've got the same cost base I was describing there, Paul, I think that would be break even. But you can see it's about improving efficiency as well as improving effectiveness webinar. And that's why I think you've got to start looking at, I've got the right type of staff. And we find often that the staff involved in workplace learning, supporting, for example, apprenticeships, our workplace tutors, are actually very well equipped to do this because they're all already with that employer. They understand the needs of employers, and they obviously understand the needs of learners that want to progress to apprenticeship. So it's been working more effectively. I've talked about completion outcomes, funding and qualification quality implications on 16 to 18 traineeships. This is taken straight from the ESFA guidance. I think it's just important to realize that one of the risks we take with this is that they don't often, get it completely wrong. But if you do get it completely wrong, it's negative in retention terms and negative in quality terms. And I showed you with that example previously. But obviously what's different is these learners are expected to complete all the elements of the programs, including the functional skills. Now, as John has already said, it's much better for them to do functional skills because you just don't have that window, particularly the assessment window, or the time to do a GCSE. So we're finding the functional skills the most that some of those learners are doing, certainly in the longer programs. But because these are part-time learners, we're also using stepping stone qualifications, and in some cases where we've assessed the learners, we're using other means as well. As long as we've obviously got the means of delivering English and maths, as long as they're appropriate to that learner and actually moving them on to a higher level in which they've assessed them or they actually have come in. Now for adults, it's a different funding formula. For the 19 to 24s, they're funded through your adult education budget or through a specific contract that's been issued to you if, for example, you've gone through a market entry point, such as a procurement. Here, we fund the work experience and work preparation together. So that's different from the past, and that's funded at £970. The work experience here must be a minimum of 100 hours. The average is about 220 to 240, and it must consist of qualifications and units approved for 19-year-olds. So you've got to make sure you go onto the hub to see which qualifications are eligible to be funded for adults on traineeships. But here it's different from the 16 to 18, where it's not the planned hours, it's the planned activities, and 80% of the activity is earned on retention, that's staying on program, and 20% on achievement, including the 20% achievement of the work experience. So the £970 is not earned by you. You earn 80% if the person's retained to the end, 20% only if they get the outcome, and those are defined as an apprenticeship, sustainable employment, or further study. So please be aware that for adults there is an achievement element for each aspect of it. Now, the way we calculate whether this is an efficient model or not is by using the single activity matrix. But obviously we've got £970 already allocated. The flexible element might be here. If we're offering a functional skill, we've got to use the functional skill value. So for example, if we're offering a functional skill in maths to an adult, it's £941. If it's a functional skill in English, it's £724. ESOL will again be based on whatever the ESOL rate is, depending on the nature of the, whether it's speaking, listening, or something bigger. So here's an example of one of our 19 to 24s on a traineeship. They're actually mixed in with younger people. These are the ones that are preparing for entrance into the horticulture industry. And you can see that's quite a big program. There's £970 attached to the work placement and the level 1 award in CV writing. They're doing 2 functional skills, and they're in a class of level 1 certificate in land-based studies, which is offered anyway, so they infill into that. And of course, the key element here is the work placement and the preparation for that work placement, and there's just over £3,000. But remember, 80% of that £3,000 is based on retention, 20% is based on achievement of completing the work placement and getting an appropriate progression, 20% attached to the functional skill in maths, English, and of course the level 1 certificate. So again, you can see here that if you're going to improve your efficiency here, retention on each element is critical, as well as obviously achievement. So more and more of this is obviously moving us in another direction. I just want to sort of finish off by saying, of course, that traineeships are now very much featuring on the localized and the devolution discussions, and not only for adults, because LEPs and combined authorities are trying to line up and saying that they need so many traineeships. It's certainly been a feature of the AB procurement exercise, and we'll be, by the way, looking at that certainly this afternoon in the webinar we're running at 4 o'clock, but in future webinars, you'll find that that was one of the key priorities that was being, and some providers who have not done well in the procurement exercise did not understand that traineeships was one of the key priorities and put no activity against traineeships. And in fact, we've been looking at some of the local outcome agreements in the combined authorities in our area, that's the Sheffield City region in Manchester, and actually there's quite an emphasis on traineeships as a lead-in to apprenticeships. So you can see quite significant weight being put there. For me, one of the key, if you know, it's all right, we've got to get the employer engaged, we know that, and that means they've got to understand what traineeship is. We've got to make sure the trainee is engaged, and therefore they mustn't be under any misconception. The weakness in some of this is that you ask a lot of trainees, do you know you're on the traineeship? And they say no. Do you know what this is about? No. And that therefore is a massive gap in their commitment and engagement. I think the work experience for me is critical. It must relate to the trainee's aspirations. So it must link with that profile, with what they have looked for in terms of their expectations and objectives. You must have the right commitment of staff towards this. So you've got to have, you know, because in some cases these are smaller groups, 8 to 10s. You've got to understand that that is, all right, it's not looking brilliant compared to the study program with 16 to 18, but what is its purpose? We need to make sure that written agreement is very clearly there about what that work experience will involve and how every partner to that work experience is going to be involved. It has to have a structured induction, clear objectives. There's got to be a workplace mentor. We found working with, even with the SMEs, working with the owner has been critical, because the owner has had a personal investment. Wherever that personal investment has been very strong, there's been a much better traineeship. But it's actually got some of the owners to come and say, well, what else are they doing? Is their vocational studies relevant? And they start to get involved in that. We've also mapped everything that that trainee would be doing where they use one file or some other e-portfolio system, to their English and math, so that they keep on seeing and being reinforced. One of the most important things about effectiveness is to make sure that English and maths is being reinforced all the way through the work experience, as well as obviously getting feedback from the learner, feedback from the employer, and having frequent meetings, particularly with our workplace assessors who go out and do these about the progress. So for example, if you look at the weekly tasks for 1 week, 5 tasks, we map those tasks with the employer out against English or ESOL, maths and employability skills. With one of our partners, they also ask to put digital skills there. So because they think one of the key things is that a lot of their trainees need to understand that they're going to be using a lot of digital skills in employment in that particular sector. So having that familiarity with the ICT is critical. Again, hopefully if you're doing that, it makes the thing more relevant, it adds to the quality, you get more likely to get completion and more likely to get a successful outcome. As well as understanding that there are all kinds of support funding available for traineeships. In other words, we're not only asking some employers to pay travel and meal allowances, we've got some employers who will actually pay the going rate, the minimum rate, but it's not an expectation of all employers. And I think obviously that's one of the big issues here, is that very often the trainees are not aware that they can get some support from the employer. The most we have said, it certainly the average that we tend to get in terms of support is things like travel and meal allowances. In other words, they often treat them as their staff, as temporary staff, and give them access to some of the benefits that they would have got if they were permanent staff. But plus all the other forms of support I've talked about there. Because remember, the other reason that sometimes traineeships don't work is not just the sustainability of funding, it's the sustainability of support funding. And we found that some learners have left early because the learning support needs were not identified early enough, or we weren't aware of the fact that they had some significant financial blocks that made it important for them to access learner support, the discretionary learner support, as soon as possible. Now, what have inspectors found? Well, not a lot of traineeship has been separately inspected, even though it is a separate part. Study programs, apprenticeships, high needs provision, adult provision, and traineeships. There've been 1 or 2 grades, and they've not been bad. We haven't had any sort of quite significant inadequates. But what is important is that this is what they're looking at. So as a provider, you've got to say, right, if I put myself in the shoes of an inspector, and particularly if you've not been inspected yet, and if you've got substantial traineeship, either as part of study programs, as part of your adult education, is these are the things to be looking for. They're not that different. But what we found, more importantly, was, and this is really the final sort of points I want to make, what really makes traineeships more effective, and we've got this not only from our own research, from our own experience, but also from working with our partners. Particularly, we work with a large number of colleges. We have over 40 colleges working with us, as well as with subcontractors. Is the first thing was, let's match. If you don't get the match between the needs and capabilities of the trainee and the requirements of the employer, that's a long dialogue, by the way, but by profiling those trainees using the systems I talked about earlier, we've actually found that's helpful. That means you're going to get more commitment on both parts, and that's critical. We've also found that when we know what the employer's workforce development strategy is, it's helped us to then plug this in. For example, if it's the National Health Service careers, or that each of those trusts and each one of those activities has got a workforce development strategy, we can see exactly where trainees fit, so we can actually match it. With new store openings in the retail sector, whether be the Trinity Centre in Leeds, or for example the new store at IKEA in Sheffield, it's what are your needs in terms of labour? How soon does that labour need to be available? Can we put some of our existing learners or new learners into other stores in the region on traineeships, take them through an induction? They can then be part of your store opening team. We found that working really well, and that obviously means that you can also get a range of pathways, because some are in selling, some are in customer relations, some are in IT, some are in admin, some are in warehousing, some are in security. We found, certainly from our first experience, the quicker the trainee gets into the work placement, because that's the key difference. That's where you're going to make the difference. The better, We've also found that then making sure that everything that the learner does, the English, maths, and any flexibility, is actually based around that work placement. So every time they go in the work placement, every time they're in the workplace, they're seeing how they're picking up employability, English and maths. We found that if the employer can, if they're large enough, they might have a training manager. If not, it might be the owner, is to make sure that they're a full partner in it. Because we found again that from the first experience, when employers were not sure of what their actual involvement was, they knew it was a work experience. They'd had work experience before, but only maybe for a week. And then all of a sudden they find they've got the learner for 12 weeks. It was very difficult if they weren't fully aware and supported and guided. And we spent a lot of time on that. You can see that there's an investment cost, which might put you off, but if it works, it gives you a good return. Regular contact to make sure that everything is working and the employer is providing the learning. Remember, this is a learning program. It is not cheap labor. And I think that's why as soon as you start to get some concerns about what the learner is not picking up and you're not reviewing that on a regular basis, I would remove the learner. We found that having structured workbooks, progress diaries, using one file made that we were constantly getting some sense of how that trainee was doing, as well as getting feedback from the employer, and obviously making sure that that supervision was there on a regular basis, if not face-to-face, certainly online. The good quality exit interview was critical, because once you've got the employer saying, right, I think this person should now go for one of our jobs that we're advertising, or a trainee or an apprenticeship is great. If not, then we would like to recommend them to, so for example, in Leeds, we found that although people didn't get jobs at Debenhams, they were obviously referred to Accessorize and were successful in securing jobs there. I think for me the greatest thing here is in the minds of the learner and the parents, particularly if they're younger trainees, is that you've got to see this as almost like a seamless progression to employment apprenticeship training. It's not like a sort of, oh, at the end of this you might do something. This is you getting ready. This is you preparing for it. And that's why sometimes I think it might be, right, once you know the learner wants to do an apprenticeship, is actually be honest and say this is their pre-apprenticeship. And I think one of you already said that's what's made your programs more successful. I think also it's trying to get that mix of accredited and non-accredited learning. Not everything needs to lead to a qualification. You've got the work preparation element for adults that makes up the £970. You can put activity into the tutorial for 16 to 18 as part of the hours for a study program. So it's not, there's no necessity to always try and find a little award or certificate. It's where it helps, particularly where it helps with the particular, so it might be a safety, it might be a health and safety qual, it could be a specific short IT, then it makes a difference. Particularly for that pathway. So hopefully you've got some idea now about the funding, about how to achieve efficiency, some ideas about how to use the different models in terms of effectiveness. I think there's still some issues and concerns. It's a relatively low take-up, especially in FE colleges. And in fact, last August to January, we don't know what August to January this year will be like. The numbers actually fell. We have had some problems with local benefits offices restricting access to some people who've said that they would lose their job seekers allowance, whatever, but that's becoming less and less of an issue. I think it's been difficult to market them, and I think that's because we've had a problem with the brand. It's and it might need rebranding. I say it should always be part of the apprenticeship offer, and it should also be part of the employment strategy, particularly at local level, or for that employer, like for example in the health service, it's part of the workforce development strategy. Once you can say to a local authority or to a large employer, make traineeships part of, or internships, if it's, for example, supported internships for those learners with learning difficulties and disabilities, it's part of your HR strategy, then I think you've got a long way towards it. If they're small employers, then I think, again, it's just saying how this might take some of the risk out of maybe employing someone on a permanent basis or as an apprentice, because this gives you the chance to try them out. I think one of the big problems we've had is that it is very unclear as to what is the overall objective. It's okay saying it's about getting into apprenticeships or going into employment or going into substantial education programs, but that purpose has got to be one which is shared not just between you, the provider, and your guidance staff, but with that young person, with their parents or guardians, and the employer. So I think there is some issue about, is the traineeship brand tarnished? Has it got, you know, we've all heard about the not so good aspects of it, and the sort of arguments about cheap labour and things like that. So it does raise some interesting issues. But so does the word internship, you know, the negative connotations around that. It's not enough to have the employer say, yeah, I'm going to take on this person. The support is not only got to be, yes, I'm keen to be, it's got to be, and I know what this means. And we haven't had enough support from employers. Either they haven't just come in numbers, and even when they've come, they haven't necessarily realised the requirements on them and the commitment they'd have to make. I think the overall progression to apprenticeships is low. Between the two age groups, it's only 22%. So there seems to be a key issue about how fit its purpose has been. And I think that's why we might have to be a bit more honest and say that if we know this is about progression to apprenticeship, then we're clear about what the apprenticeship requirements are, and then the traineeship helps to deliver it. So you might be a different focus altogether. So from, say, another learner who might only be wanting to see if this is giving them an idea of what jobs they might want to do in future or what further education they want. I think for us as providers, two funding regimes has caused confusion and extra administration, and it has done, because you've got two different monitoring systems, two different calculation systems as well. And I think the other concern, certainly shown by people such as the AELP, is, you know, do we know if that funding is going to be retained? Are they still going to be a flavour of the month? And, you know, from what you've said so far, is the investment worth it? Is it worth investing in that employer engagement, in individually designed flexible programs? Even if you've managed to get around the infill issue, which I'm sure we've all done, it's about, you know, but we still have to make sure there's quite a lot of one-to-one support for that learner in terms of mentoring and coaching. Is it actually worthwhile when we've only got one group, maybe of 5 or 6? You know, at what point does that become just simply not a viable offer? So, or are there any other issues that you might think are causing you to be hesitant about investing in traineeships or doing more? Our commitment is, and I say this all as a college governor as well as a director of e-Memoir and of Learning Curve, is that we see a clear place for traineeships in the offer, driven very much by our experience to make sure that it is very much tailored to the needs of that employer and the young person. And the biggest investment for us has been in the matching process, the profiling, making sure this is the right match. Because to some extent, this is your credibility as well. You know, if we match someone with a hairdressing salon and the match is not right and the trainee doesn't deliver and they don't get taken on, or don't get an apprenticeship with that hairdressing salon owner will certainly talk to other hairdressing salon owners about, well, they were let down, we thought this was a good idea. So, you know, promoting our existing students through traineeships is a good strategy, particularly our level 2s that don't want to carry on to level 3. But remember, you've got a credibility and a reputational issue there. So that's why I think we've got to be you know, we've got to reduce the risks. And for us, by doing that and spending more time on that, we've had a much better experience. It's both efficient, because it's brought in enough money to cover all its costs, but also it's more effective. Hopefully you found that useful. Thanks very much for the questions that have come in. Those of you, by the way, who are going to listen in on the recording, if the questions that have coming have not been ones that you would have asked, but would like to ask other questions, then as Marek says, please get in touch with us. Our contact details are there. They're my details as well as e-Memoir. And for those of you who are not subscribers or not renewed your subscription, just be aware of our current offer. If you want an annual subscription, obviously this is from the point at which you actually commit, it's £500 at the moment plus VAT. This will covers the whole of your organisation, so all your staff can access whatever is relevant. We've got a full list on our website of the upcoming webinars. So you'll get at least 50 one-hour webinars, including obviously today's. But also you've got a back catalogue of well over 100 webinars that we've been running right up until August of this year, as well as obviously blogs and other documents, as well as obviously access to e-Memoir TV, which includes quite a lot of videos. So hopefully you'll take up this offer. If you want to, just obviously get in touch with us at those 2 points. Any other questions? Thanks very much for your feedback, by the way. We've had some good questions and some comments. That's very helpful. Yeah, great. Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much, Sue. Thanks, Dillis. Thanks, Graham. And again, those of you who might have time today at 4 o'clock, Manic, we've got another webinar, haven't we?
Sorry, I muted myself there. Oh, crack, it's the adult community learning, isn't it?
Adult community learning. It's a repeat of the one we did in August, because quite a lot of you weren't able to attend that one. And that's at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Go onto our website. That again is complimentary. This morning and this afternoon's are complimentary webinars, which will be added to any subscription that you currently have or intend to have, by the way. So please take advantage of this afternoon, or at least tell one of your colleagues that there's something on this afternoon about adult community learning. So thanks very much then. Thanks for the questions and thanks for the comments.